90s, CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. My colleague walked into my office and he said, "Dr. Burke, have you seen this?" In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America.
Yes, I definitely have heard of the ACEs study, or Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it is hugely impactful to discover in adults and in younger folks the things they've experienced as a child and how it's impacting them now. It can be very telling to talk about stress, to talk about anxiety, or maybe just the way they're coping with their lives currently. Things that have happened in the past still impact us many years later.
I hadn't heard of the ACEs study until just recently when I became involved with Generation Wellness. But I know today that some of the things on the ACEs study do play a part in like substance abuse and mental health and things like that that happen to you in your childhood.
Stress, number one, stress affects us all. And stress can be a feeling of worry, trouble, anxiety, or just pressure. What's important to remember about stress is that it doesn't have to be a negative thing. There's positive stress in our lives every day. When stress becomes a problem is when it does have a negative impact on our lives. I think what differentiates stress is the cause. So good stress can be planning a party and little things to do. And more negative stress can be from more impactful events that happen, for example, in childhood. Domestic abuse, sexual abuse, trauma that happens a lot in this county and everywhere. So stress really is just that feeling of worry and anxiety, and it's extremely different depending on the cause.
But trauma is a lot of different things. I mean, trauma is going to bed hungry. Trauma is not being liked by your friends, being made fun of because you don't have the best things when you're just trying to survive. And you know, most people think of trauma as an accident that happened. Well, I don't think that that's always the case. I think that, you know, trauma has a lot of different meanings. It's not just an accident.
Toxic stress, I think, is an ongoing stress that you haven't been able to take care of or alleviate.
Adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions.
When you're resilient, I think it's about overcoming and adapting to the things that happen to you.
Resiliency, I think, is your ability to bounce back from an experience and how quick you bounce back.
To be resilient is to bounce back after something negative has happened, whether that's at home or at school or with your friends, just to be able to bounce back and persevere.
My name is Dylan Book, and I was involved in a very traumatic accident at the age of 17. And in the hospital, I was prescribed, obviously, a high amount of sedatives, to keep me calm. And I didn't know why I ended up in the hospital or what even happened. And so when I left the hospital, I was prescribed a very high amount of painkillers and antidepressant and anxiety medication. And it didn't take very long for me to become mentally and physically addicted to these things. When I started doing things that I never thought that I would do for this stuff, it just wasn't a life that I wanted to live. And I became mentally, physically, spiritually bankrupt, and my life was going nowhere. I reached out to my family and asked for help, and immediately I was put into treatment, and that's where things really changed for me. And I saw hope in treatment, and I saw that my life could get better if I wanted to change and had the willingness to do that. When I got into treatment, they stopped asking me, like, what's the matter with you, or why are you doing these things? And they obviously asked me, what happened to you, or I honestly believe today that God met me where I was at that day. And when I became willing to change my life, that's where things really started. Today, I get to live a very great life. I get to, go to sleep and know that tomorrow is going to be another day, and that I'm able to wake up and do the things that I want to do.
This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement.
I'm Casey Barrow-Miner, and I'm a part of a new generation.
I'm Carol Bayer, and I'm part of a new generation.
My name is Michelle Leonard, Dallas Center Police Chief, and I'm a part of the new generation.
My name is Joseph Dantzler, and I'm a part of a new generation.
My name is Dylan, and I'm a part of a new generation.